The tin plate felt impossibly heavy in Akiko's hands. She stood in the mess hall of Camp Clarion, her bare feet cold against concrete that still held the chill of the California dawn, and stared at what had been placed before her. Steam rose from a thick slice of pork, glistening with fat. Beside it sat 2 pieces of bread. Not the sawdust biscuits she'd eaten on the island, not the moldy rice from the transport ship, but actual bread, soft and white, still warm enough that she could see the heat shimmer above it. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Her stomach, which had learned to expect nothing, cramped with sudden, violent hunger. "It's poisoned," whispered Fumiko beside her, her voice barely audible above the shuffle of 200 women filing through the line. "They're trying to kill us quickly. Better than what we deserve." Akiko's fingers trembled. The plate rattled against the metal tray beneath it. Around her, the other women stood frozen in various stages of disbelief. Some holding their trays at arm's length as if the food might explode, others pressing the plates close to their faces to inhale the scent they'd been trained to forget existed. One woman near the back had already collapsed, though whether from shock or malnutrition, Akiko couldn't tell. Lieutenant Chen, the American officer who'd supervised their entry into the camp 3 hours earlier, stood beside the serving line with her arms crossed. She was younger than Akiko had expected, perhaps 26, with dark hair pulled into a regulation bun and eyes that seemed to catalog everything without judgment. When she spoke, her Japanese was textbook perfect but emotionally flat, as if she'd learned the language from manuals rather than people. "The food is not poisoned," Lieutenant Chen said, addressing the room. "You will eat 3 meals per day. Breakfast includes protein, bread, and fruit when available. You will not be starved. You will not be tortured. You are prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention, and you will be treated as such." No one moved. Akiko's mind raced through the propaganda films they'd been shown before deployment. American soldiers tearing apart villages, laughing as they burned food stores, dragging prisoners behind trucks until their bodies came apart. She'd been stationed on Tinian as a communications officer, translating intercepted American radio chatter, and she'd believed every word of those films. Why wouldn't she? Her country had told her these truths, and her country had never lied. Except here she stood, holding pork and bread. "Sit down and eat," Lieutenant Chen said, her tone shifting to something harder. "That's an order, not a request." The women shuffled to the long wooden tables that filled the hall. Akiko found herself sitting between Fumiko and an older woman named Hoshiko, who'd been a nurse on Saipan before the surrender. Hoshiko's hands shook so badly she couldn't hold her fork. The utensil clattered against the plate 3 times before she gave up and used her fingers instead, pinching a small piece of pork between her thumb and forefinger. She brought it to her lips, hesitated, then placed it on her tongue. Her eyes closed. A sound escaped her throat. Not quite a sob, not quite a gasp, and tears began streaming down her weathered face. She chewed slowly, reverently, as if the act of eating might be interrupted at any moment by the violence they'd all been promised. When she swallowed, she pressed both palms against her chest and bent forward over the table, weeping silently. "It's real," Hoshiko whispered in Japanese. "Oh gods, it's real." That's when the dam broke. Women all around the hall began eating, tentatively at first, then with increasing desperation. Some cried as they chewed. Others ate in grim silence, their faces blank with confusion. A few retched immediately, their bodies rejecting the richness after months of starvation rations. Fumiko took one bite of bread and had to stop, her hand covering her mouth, tears streaming down both cheeks. "I don't understand," Fumiko said, her voice breaking. "Why would they feed us? We were told they would." She couldn't finish the sentence. Akiko stared at her own plate. She'd been 23 years old when the war started, a university student studying English literature in Tokyo. She'd translated Shakespeare for fun, had dreamed of becoming a teacher, had once believed the world was fundamentally good. Then the recruiters came and the translations she did changed from poetry to military intelligence. She'd spent 3 years on Tinian, listening to American pilots coordinate their bombing runs, translating their casual conversations about baseball and girlfriends while their planes carried death toward Japanese cities. She'd hated them with a purity that felt religious. But this food, this warmth, this absence of immediate violence, didn't fit the narrative she'd carried like armor. If Americans were monsters, why did the pork taste like salvation? If they wanted Japanese women to suffer, why had Lieutenant Chen personally ensured that Hoshiko, who'd collapsed during processing, was carried to the medical tent instead of being left on the ground? Akiko cut a small piece of pork. The meat was tender, seasoned with something that tasted like herbs she couldn't name. She chewed slowly, aware that this single act was shattering something inside her that she didn't yet know how to rebuild. Around the hall, American soldiers stood at attention near the exits. Guards, presumably, though none of them held their rifles in ready position. One of them, a young private with red hair and freckles, was watching the Japanese women eat with an expression that looked almost like relief. When he noticed Akiko looking at him, he didn't sneer or threaten. He just nodded once, a small acknowledgement of her humanity, then returned his gaze to the middle distance. This confused her more than anything else. Lieutenant Chen moved through the hall, pausing at each table. When she reached Akiko's group, she crouched down so her face was level with theirs, a gesture of equality that felt shocking in its casualness. "Some of you will get sick tonight," she said in that same careful Japanese. "Your bodies aren't used to this much food. There are buckets in your barracks and a medical officer on duty. If you need help, ask. No one will punish you for being ill." Hoshiko looked up at her with red-rimmed eyes. "Why?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "Why are you being kind to us?" Lieutenant Chen's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Something that might have been pain or memory, or perhaps just exhaustion. "Because you're human beings," she said simply. "And because the war is over." But the war wasn't over. Not in their minds, not in the weight of shame that pressed against their chests every time they took another bite, not in the knowledge that they'd surrendered instead of dying honorably. The Emperor's voice had crackled through the radio on August 15th, telling them to endure the unendurable. And they'd laid down their weapons on tinny, and while American soldiers shouted orders they couldn't understand and pushed them toward transport ships. Akiko had expected to die on that ship. They all had. They'd been packed into the hold like cargo, given water but no food for the first 3 days, and the woman next to her, a teenager named Yuki who'd been a typist, had whispered her final prayers every night, convinced each sunset would be her last. But instead, they'd arrived at a California port, been loaded onto trucks, and driven to this camp in the desert valley where the air smelled like sage and dust. And now they were eating pork. "How do we carry this?" Fumiko whispered, staring at her half-finished plate. "How do we carry the kindness when we know what we deserve?" Akiko had no answer. She took another bite of bread and tasted salt. Her own tears, she realized, which were falling without her permission, without her acknowledgement, without the stoic control she'd maintained through 3 years of war. The mess hall slowly emptied as women finished eating or gave up trying. The American soldiers collected the trays with the same efficiency they'd shown in distributing them. No one hit anyone. No one shouted. No one performed the casual cruelties Akiko had been promised would define captivity. As she walked back toward the barracks with the others, the morning sun was fully up, painting the California hills the color of amber and gold. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear birds, actual birds, singing songs that had nothing to do with war or empire or shame. And in her stomach, impossibly, was the warm weight of pork and bread. The barracks smelled like fear and unwashed bodies. Akiko lay on her assigned cot, a thin mattress over metal springs, but infinitely better than the transport ship's floor, and stared at the wooden ceiling. Around her, 200 women tried to process what had just happened. Some slept immediately, their bodies surrendering to exhaustion the moment they felt safe enough to close their eyes. Others sat in small clusters, whispering theories in Japanese that ranged from cautious optimism to paranoid certainty that this was all an elaborate psychological torture. Fumiko sat on the cot beside Akiko's, hugging her knees to her chest. She was 20 years old, had been a radio operator on Tinian like Akiko, and had the kind of delicate beauty that made men stupid and women protective. During their 3 months together before the surrender, Fumiko had confessed that she'd joined the military to escape an arranged marriage to a merchant 40 years her senior. The war, she'd said with bitter irony, had seemed like the safer option. "Do you think they're fattening us up for something?" Fumiko asked, her voice small. "The way you fatten a pig before slaughter?" "I don't know," Akiko admitted. She turned onto her side to face Fumiko. "But Lieutenant Chen, when she spoke to Hoshiko, I saw her face. She wasn't performing. She meant what she said." "How can you tell?" "I spent 3 years translating American voices. You learn to hear what's underneath the words." Fumiko considered this. "What did you hear in her voice?" Akiko closed her eyes, replaying the moment. Conviction, and maybe sadness, like she'd seen too much and was trying to make it mean something. Across the barracks, Hoshiko was examining the younger women who'd gotten sick after eating, her nurse's instincts overriding her own exhaustion. She moved from cot to cot with gentle efficiency, checking pulses, asking questions in the calm voice of someone who'd triaged casualties during bombings. When she reached a girl named Tomoko, barely 18, who'd been vomiting in the latrine for the last hour, Hoshiko pressed her palm to the girl's forehead and frowned. "She's burning up," Hoshiko announced. "Not from the food. From infection, I think. She needs antibiotics." One of the American guards, hearing the urgency in Hoshiko's tone, even if she didn't understand the words, approached immediately. "Problem?" she asked in English. Akiko sat up. This was the first time she'd spoken English since her capture, and the words felt strange on her tongue, like admitting to a secret identity she'd kept hidden. "Sick girl. Fever. Needs medicine." The guard's eyes widened slightly. "You speak English?" "Yes. I was translator. Before." The guard studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "I'll get the medic. Stay with her." She disappeared through the barracks door, moving with purpose. Akiko crossed to Tomoko's cot and knelt beside Hoshiko. The girl was shivering despite the warmth of the morning. Her lips cracked and bleeding, her skin grayish. She'd been in bad shape on the transport ship, Akiko remembered, had been beaten by their own Japanese sergeant for crying during a bombing, and the bruises had never properly healed. "Tomoko-chan," Akiko whispered, brushing sweat-soaked hair from the girl's forehead. "Help is coming. Stay awake for me." Tomoko's eyes fluttered open. "Akiko-san, are we dead? Is this the afterlife?" "No, child. We're in America. We're prisoners. But they fed us. Why would they feed us if we're supposed to suffer?" It was the same question they were all asking in different words in the silence between heartbeats. Akiko had no answer that made sense in the framework they'd been given. The propaganda had been so absolute, so total in its dehumanization of the enemy, that any act of mercy felt like a trick or a dream. The door opened again, and the guard returned with a man in a white medical coat. He was older, perhaps 50, with kind eyes behind wire-frame glasses and the unhurried movements of someone who'd spent decades setting broken bones and soothing fevered patients. He carried a leather medical bag that looked well used. "I'm Dr. Morrison," he said in English, then looked at Akiko. "You translate?" "Yes." "Good. Tell her I need to examine her. I'm not going to hurt her, but I need to see where the pain is." Akiko translated, and Tomoko nodded weakly. Dr. Morrison's hands were gentle as he checked her vital signs, palpated her abdomen, and examined the half-healed bruises on her ribs. His expression grew darker as he worked, and when he pressed one particular spot on her right side, Tomoko cried out in pain. "Peritonitis," Dr. Morrison said quietly. "Probably from internal injuries that weren't treated." "How long has she been like this?" Akiko asked Tomoko, who could barely speak. 3 weeks. Since the beating. Dr. Morrison's jaw tightened. "She needs surgery. Now, tell her I'm going to take her to the hospital tent, and that she's going to be fine, but she needs to trust me." Akiko translated, and Tomoko began to cry. Not from fear, Akiko thought, but from the sheer incomprehensibility of an enemy doctor promising to save her life. Dr. Morrison called for a stretcher, and 2 orderlies arrived to carefully transfer Tomoko from the cot. As they carried her toward the door, Hoshiko followed. "I'm a nurse," she said in Japanese, then looked at Akiko desperately. "Tell him I'm a nurse. Let me help." Akiko translated. Dr. Morrison studied Hoshiko, her steady hands, her professional bearing, the way she'd instinctively positioned herself at Tomoko's head to monitor her breathing. He nodded. "She can assist. Tell her to follow me." They disappeared into the sunlight, leaving behind a barracks full of women who'd just witnessed their enemy save one of their own. Fumiko moved to stand beside Akiko. "This is breaking my mind," she whispered. "Everything we were told, all the reasons we were supposed to fight. What does it mean if they were lies?" "It means we were children," Akiko said quietly. "And children believe what their parents tell them, even when their parents are monsters." She regretted the words immediately. Speaking against the Empire, even here, even in defeat, felt like blasphemy. But Fumiko didn't recoil. Instead, she took Akiko's hand and squeezed it once, a silent acknowledgement that some truths were too large to voice aloud, but impossible to keep inside. The rest of the day passed in a strange limbo. At noon, lunch arrived. Soup with vegetables and chicken, more bread, and something the Americans called pudding that tasted sweet and creamy and made several women weep again. At dinner, there was fish and rice and canned fruit, portions that seemed obscenely large after months of starvation. Between meals, the women were allowed to wash using actual soap and hot water in a communal shower facility. The water pressure was gentle, and the temperature was carefully regulated. There were even towels, rough but clean, stacked on benches. Akiko stood under the spray for far longer than necessary, watching dirt and salt and 3 years of accumulated despair spiral down the drain. When she emerged, feeling lighter than she had in months, she found Lieutenant Chen waiting outside with a clipboard. "Akiko Tanaka?" the lieutenant asked, checking her list. "Yes. You speak English fluently. We need translators for camp operations, explaining rules, medical visits, that sort of thing. Would you be willing to help?" It wasn't really a question, Akiko understood, but it was phrased like one. Like she had agency. Like her skills mattered more than her status as a defeated enemy. She thought about Tomoko on that stretcher, about Hoshiko's desperate need to be useful, about the taste of pork on her tongue this morning. "Yes," she said. "I'll help." Lieutenant Chen's expression softened just slightly. "Good. Report to the administration building after breakfast tomorrow." "And Tanaka?" "Yes. Thank you. I know this isn't easy." Akiko almost laughed. Not easy. That was like calling the ocean damp or the sun warm, an understatement so profound it became its own kind of truth. But she understood what Lieutenant Chen meant. The lieutenant was trying, in her awkward American way, to acknowledge the impossible position they were all in. "Lieutenant," Akiko said carefully, "the girl Tomoko. Will she live?" Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Dr. Morrison is the best surgeon in 3 counties. If anyone can save her, he can. It wasn't a promise, but it was hope. And hope had been absent from Akiko's life for so long that she'd forgotten what it tasted like. It was bitter and sweet simultaneously, painful in the way light hurts when you've been in darkness too long. That night, lying in her cot with her stomach full for the first time in months, Akiko stared at the ceiling and tried to reconcile the 2 versions of reality competing in her mind. In one version, she was a prisoner of war, defeated and dishonored, awaiting whatever punishment her captors deemed appropriate. In the other version, she was a woman who'd eaten pork and bread, who'd translated for a doctor trying to save a girl's life, who'd been thanked by an American officer for her cooperation. Both versions couldn't be true simultaneously, but somehow, impossibly, they were. Beside her, Fumiko was already asleep, one hand tucked under her cheek like a child. Across the barracks, a woman was singing softly, a lullaby from before the war, from when the world still made sense. Other voices joined in, creating a harmony that filled the wooden building with something almost like peace. Akiko closed her eyes and let herself believe, just for tonight, that maybe they would survive this. That maybe survival didn't require death. That maybe the worst was already behind them. She was wrong about that last part, but she didn't know it yet. Dr. Morrison emerged from the hospital tent at 3 in the morning, his surgical gown stained with blood, and told Akiko, who'd refused to sleep until she knew, that the girl would recover fully given time and proper nutrition. The infection had been severe, he explained through obvious exhaustion, but they'd caught it before it spread to her bloodstream. Another week without treatment, and she would have died slowly and painfully. She's lucky you were here to translate, Dr. Morrison said, pulling off his surgical gloves. Otherwise, we might not have understood the urgency in time. Lucky. The word felt absurd in the context of everything that had brought them to this moment, but Akiko understood what he meant. In the terrible arithmetic of war, some survived through skill and some through chance, and the line between the two was often invisible until long after the fact. News of Tomoko's successful surgery spread through the barracks like wildfire. Women who'd been holding themselves rigid with suspicion began to relax incrementally. If the Americans were willing to perform emergency surgery on a prisoner, using their own supplies, their own expertise, their own time, then perhaps the kindness wasn't an elaborate deception. Perhaps it was simply what it appeared to be. But acceptance didn't come easily. On the third day, a woman named Keiko refused to eat. She was 34, had been a teacher in Osaka before the war, and had the kind of quiet dignity that made people listen when she spoke. She sat at the breakfast table with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the mess hall walls. "I cannot accept their charity," she said when Akiko tried to convince her. "It would dishonor my family. Better to starve with dignity than to live as a beggar." "You're not begging," Akiko argued. "You're a prisoner of war. They're required to feed you under international law. Their law, not ours." It was an argument Akiko couldn't win because it wasn't really about food. It was about shame, about the impossible burden of survival when death had been framed as the only honorable option. Keiko had lost 2 sons in the Philippines and a husband in the bombing of Tokyo. What right did she have, she seemed to be saying with her silence, to eat pork and bread when they had died with nothing? Lieutenant Chen noticed the untouched tray and approached with her usual careful neutrality. "Problem?" she asked Akiko. "She won't eat. Says it dishonors her family." The lieutenant was quiet for a long moment, studying Keiko's rigid posture. Then she pulled up a chair and sat down across from the Japanese woman, close enough that their knees almost touched. When she spoke, her Japanese was slower than usual, weighted with thought. "My grandmother was Japanese," Lieutenant Chen said. "From Hiroshima. She married an American sailor in 1920, and her family disowned her. Told her she was a traitor, that she brought shame to their name. She never spoke to them again." Keiko's eyes flickered toward the lieutenant, surprised. "She died 6 months ago," Chun continued. "And you know what her last words to me were? She said, 'Sarah, honor means nothing if you're dead. The only real honor is in how you choose to live.'" "Your grandmother was wrong," Keiko said quietly, but there was less certainty in her voice. "Maybe. Or maybe she understood something about survival that takes getting old to learn." Lieutenant Chun stood, pushing the tray closer to Keiko. "Your family would want you to live. That's what families do. They want their people to survive. Eating doesn't dishonor them. Dying when you don't have to might." She walked away before Keiko could respond, leaving the older woman staring at the cooling eggs and bread on her plate. Akiko waited, not speaking, letting the silence do its work. Finally, after several long minutes, Keiko picked up her fork. Her hand trembled as she brought a small bite of egg to her mouth. She chewed mechanically, her expression distant, but she swallowed. Then she took another bite. It was a small victory, but Akiko had learned that in this place, small victories were the only kind available. Her work as a translator began in earnest that same day. Lieutenant Chun brought her to the administration building, a simple wooden structure that had been hastily constructed to house the camp's bureaucracy, and introduced her to Captain James Fletcher, the commanding officer. He was in his late 40s, with silver threading through his dark hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent years in the sun. His handshake was firm but not crushing, and his eyes held the kind of weariness that suggested he'd seen more than he wanted to remember. "Miss Tanaka," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "Lieutenant Chen tells me you're fluent in both languages and that you've been cooperative. I appreciate that." Akiko sat stiffly in the chair across from his desk, hyper-aware of her status. "I am trying to help where I can, Captain." "Good, because we have a problem, and I think you might be uniquely positioned to solve it." He pulled out a folder and opened it, revealing several pages of densely written Japanese text. "We've been receiving letters from your families back in Japan. Red Cross deliveries. But we don't have enough translators to process them all, and we know how important mail is to morale." Hiko's breath caught. "Letters? From Japan? 63 so far. More coming weekly." Captain Fletcher studied her carefully. "Would you be willing to translate them? Help us deliver messages to the right women. Some of them have been waiting months to hear if their families survived the bombings." The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications Akiko was only beginning to understand. If she agreed, she'd be collaborating with the enemy, not just to help with medical emergencies or explain camp rules, but to facilitate the emotional connection between prisoners and their homeland. It felt like a step further down a path she hadn't consciously chosen to walk. But she thought about Fumiko, who cried every night because she didn't know if her mother had survived the firebombing of Tokyo. She thought about Hoshiko, who'd lost track of her 3 daughters during the evacuation of Saipan. She thought about the 63 letters sitting in that folder, each one containing words that might mean everything to someone who'd given up hope. "Yes," Akiko said. "I'll do it." Captain Fletcher's expression softened with something that looked like relief. "Thank you, Miss Tanaka. I know this isn't simple for you." The work began immediately. Akiko sat at a desk in the administration building with a stack of letters and began reading through them, creating detailed notes about who each letter was addressed to and what it contained. Some were short, just confirmations that family members were alive. Others were pages long, full of detailed accounts of life in occupied Japan, of food shortages and bombed neighborhoods and children who'd been evacuated to the countryside. One letter, addressed to a woman named Sachiko Yamamoto, contained news that her husband had died in the bombing of Nagasaki. Akiko's hands trembled as she translated the careful, formal language the man's brother had used to describe his death. How he'd been working at the naval yard when the bomb fell, how it had been instantaneous, how there hadn't been enough left to bury properly. When she delivered the letter to Sachiko that evening, the woman read it in silence, her face utterly blank. Then she carefully folded the paper, placed it in her pocket, and walked outside to stand in the cool desert night. Akiko followed at a distance, worried, but Sachiko didn't collapse or scream. She just stood there, breathing slowly, looking up at stars that were the same stars shining over Japan, over the crater where her husband had died. After a long while, Sachiko turned to Akiko. "Thank you for telling me," she said quietly. Not knowing was worse. That became Akiko's reality, delivering news both good and devastating. Watching women process information that reshaped their entire worlds, being the bridge between this strange American kindness and the broken homeland they'd left behind. It was exhausting work, emotionally draining in ways that combat never had been, because combat was clean in its horror. This was messy. This required bearing witness to private grief and joy simultaneously, to holding space for contradictions that couldn't be resolved. But the letters kept coming, and Akiko kept translating because someone had to. By the second week, patterns began to emerge in the camp. The women were divided into work details. Some helped in the kitchens, others did laundry. A few with medical training assisted in the hospital tent. It wasn't forced labor in any brutal sense. Rather, it seemed to be Captain Fletcher's attempt to give them purpose and structure. Women who'd been soldiers or support staff found comfort in routine, in having tasks and expectations and small ways to feel useful. Fumiko was assigned to the camp garden, where prisoners were growing vegetables under the supervision of a cheerful American sergeant named Martinez. He knew no Japanese and couldn't care less about the war. He just loved plants and talked to them constantly in enthusiastic English while Fumiko and 3 other women weeded and watered in bemused silence. He named the tomato plants after his daughters. Fumiko reported one evening, sounding both confused and charmed. And he apologized to a zucchini for picking it too early. I think he might be insane. Or maybe he's the only sane one, Akiko suggested. Maybe talking to plants is the appropriate response to a world that dropped atomic bombs. They were sitting outside the barracks in the evening cool, watching the sun paint the California hills in shades of gold and rose. Other women had begun doing the same thing, gathering in small groups to talk or simply sit in companionable silence, slowly learning to exist in this liminal space between captivity and something that didn't quite feel like freedom but wasn't quite prison either. Hoshiko joined them, lowering herself onto the ground with a soft groan. She'd been working 12-hour shifts in the hospital tent, helping Dr. Morrison treat everything from infected wounds to chronic malnutrition. Her hands were perpetually chapped from washing, and her eyes held the particular exhaustion of someone who'd been giving more than she had to spare. "How's Tomoko?" Hiko asked. "Eating solid food now, complaining about being bored, which is how I know she's truly recovering." Hoshiko smiled tiredly. "Dr. Morrison wants to teach me American medical techniques. Says I have good instincts and steady hands. Will you learn?" Hoshiko looked down at those hands, turning them over as if seeing them for the first time. "I don't know. It feels like accepting that we're not going home anytime soon. That this place might be our lives for, I don't know how long." None of them knew. The war in Europe had been over since May, but the Pacific theater had dragged on until August, and now they were in the strange aftermath where the fighting had stopped but nothing had been resolved. Japan was occupied by American forces. The emperor had surrendered. Everything they'd believed about the empire's invincibility had been revealed as propaganda or delusion or some combination of both. "I heard from my mother," Fumiko said suddenly, her voice very quiet. "Akiko translated the letter this morning. She's alive, living with my aunt in Kyoto. The house in Tokyo is gone, burned, but she's alive." She started crying then, silently, tears streaming down her face while she smiled. Akiko put an arm around her shoulders, and Hoshiko moved closer to create a protective circle. They sat like that as the sun finished setting and the stars emerged one by one. 3 women trying to hold each other together in a world that had shattered and was slowly, painfully beginning to reform into some new shape they couldn't yet name. That night, Akiko dreamed of the transport ship, the darkness, the stench, the certainty that they were sailing toward death. But in the dream, when they finally reached land, instead of execution squads, there was just Dr. Morrison with his kind eyes and medical bag, and Lieutenant Chen with her careful Japanese, and Sergeant Martinez apologizing to vegetables in a garden that grew food for prisoners who'd been promised starvation. She woke before dawn, disoriented by the gentleness of her dreams. In the cot beside her, Fumiko slept deeply, one hand tucked under her cheek, her face peaceful for the first time since they'd met. Across the barracks, someone was humming that same lullaby from before, and someone else joined in, creating harmony in the darkness. Akiko lay very still and let herself consider the impossible possibility that they might actually survive this. That survival might not require them to abandon their dignity or their memories or the people they'd been before the war twisted them into soldiers. That perhaps the binary choice between honor through death and shame through survival had been false all along. Another lie in a cascade of lies that had defined their lives for too long. She didn't have answers. But for the first time, she thought maybe answers weren't what mattered. Maybe what mattered was the question itself. The willingness to ask it, to sit with uncertainty, to keep breathing while the world slowly revealed which truths were solid and which were just shadows cast by fear. Outside, the California dawn began its slow approach, painting the horizon in shades of hope that Akiko was just beginning to believe might be real. The transformation happened in small increments, barely noticeable day to day but undeniable when measured in weeks. By the end of October, most of the women had regained weight. Their faces filled out, their movements became less tentative, and the haunted look that had defined them during those first days in camp began to fade, replaced not by happiness exactly, but by something like equilibrium. They were learning to exist in their new reality, to navigate the strange mercy of captivity under the Geneva Convention, to reconcile the propaganda they'd been fed with the mundane kindness of Sergeant Martinez showing them how to prune tomatoes. Akiko's role as translator expanded beyond letters and medical appointments. Captain Fletcher began asking her to attend administrative meetings, to help craft announcements that would make sense to the Japanese prisoners, to serve as a bridge between two cultures that had spent years trying to destroy each other. It was uncomfortable work. She was constantly aware that her cooperation could be seen as betrayal by some of the more rigid women, but she did it anyway because the alternative was isolation and miscommunication and unnecessary suffering. One afternoon in early November, Lieutenant Chen brought her a special request. "We're getting a visitor tomorrow," the lieutenant said, spreading several documents across the desk in the administration building. "Colonel Patricia Hayes from the Women's Army Corps headquarters in Washington. She's touring POW camps to ensure compliance with international standards." Akiko scanned the documents. "You want me to translate for the inspection?" "More than that. Colonel Hayes specifically requested to speak with Japanese prisoners about their treatment. We need someone who can facilitate honest conversation, someone the women trust enough to speak freely, but who can also ensure the colonel understands the cultural context of what they're saying." It was a delicate position, Akiko understood. Too much advocacy for the prisoners might seem like ingratitude for the relative kindness they'd been shown. Too much support for the American administration might look like collaboration. She'd have to. In the aftermath of World War II, 200 Japanese women find themselves prisoners at a Californian internment camp, trapped between the propaganda they were taught and an unexpected reality that threatens to shatter everything they believed about their enemy. The women arrived expecting torture, starvation, and brutality. Everything their government promised would await them in American captivity. Instead, they encounter Captain Fletcher, a commander committed to upholding the Geneva Convention, and a staff that treats them with basic human dignity. They receive medical care, adequate food, and even the opportunity to tend a garden under the enthusiastic guidance of Sergeant Martinez, who talks to his tomato plants like children. At the heart of this story is Akiko Tanaka, a university-educated translator navigating the impossible space between two worlds. Through her eyes, we witness how mercy can be more devastating than cruelty. When your enemy feeds you instead of starving you, heals you instead of harming you, treats you like a person instead of a monster, it forces you to confront the lies you were raised on. Some women, like Fumiko and Nurse Hoshiko, begin to question everything. Others, like Sachiko who lost her husband, struggle under the weight of contradictions they cannot reconcile. A visit from Colonel Hayes exposes uncomfortable truths. The women's relatively humane treatment stems partly from their gender and partly from having a decent commander. Their dignity is conditional, circumstantial, a gift that could be revoked rather than a right. Hayes also delivers a haunting warning. These women will eventually return to a devastated Japan, changed by their experience, contaminated by enemy kindness. They'll be strangers in their homeland, unable to fit back into the rigid society they left behind. The story's power lies in its refusal to provide easy resolution. Reiko, who lost her 7-year-old daughter in the Tokyo firebombing, asks the question that haunts everyone. "When I hear that American pilots carried out those raids, I feel hate that burns. But then Dr. Morrison saved Tomoko's life. How do I hold both truths?" Colonel Hayes's response, "I don't know," is brutally honest. There are no simple answers when humanity reveals itself on both sides of a conflict, when the people who destroyed your city are the same ones teaching you about squash plants and offering you tomorrow. This narrative explores how propaganda shapes our understanding of the other, how kindness can be weaponized, and how survival sometimes means carrying contradictions that never resolve. It asks whether dignity granted conditionally is dignity at all, and what it costs to have your worldview shattered by the very people you were taught to hate. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe for more explorations of humanity in impossible situations, where right and wrong blur, and survival demands we hold multiple truths at once.